finished 21A and we got up to 21B, and the discussion was really about the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that on the one hand, we said any oihel that's not made by man is not considered an oihel. That means a tent that is made without the intention of being a tent is not considered a tent. And we seem to find contradictory statements from Rabbi Yehuda himself, where he says that the children that were making the water for the red heifer, they would sit on top of oxen, and the oxen were considered tents. And the Gemara sees that as being a proof that even though it's not made by man, it is considered a tent. And on that, the Gemara answered that there's a difference between how big the tent is. If the tent is just a handbreadth is one thing. If it's more than that, it would be a different rule. And the Gemara then got into the discussion of the laws of with regard to the law of the red heifer, making the red heifer, using a board, using some type of a door that they would sit on, according to the other opinion, and why, what did that help, and what was the reason Rabbi Yehuda wasn't happy with that, and why was that not considered good enough? And the Gemara said, well, first of all, it was good enough. Rabbi Yehuda just said you don't need it. But that also would be a tent. Having a door on top of the oxen, that would also be a tent. And then the Gemara mentioned that the problem with the door was a different problem. Not that it's not a tent. The problem with having a door, sitting on top of the door, is that the child might feel too safe and too secure. And he'll actually bend over and look over the sides. And what will happen is he could become impure from looking over the sides, because there is no more tent. The door itself would be a tent, but if the door is so secure, then he might actually look over it or put his limbs over it, and he could become impure. And from that, what the Gemara uses the term kever hatahoim, the unknown impurity of a grave, unknown grave. Now, the Gemara then said that there's a source to that explanation. We have a source for it in a brisa that it actually explains Rabbi Yehuda's view and spells it out. And it says those words about the child feels secure and he might put his head over or one of his limbs over, he'll become tameh, become impure. So better just to have these Egyptian oxen that are very fat. And because they were so wide, they would be a perfect tent against impurity for the child who's sitting on top of that.
Hi, are you not supposed to be here at 10 o'clock to relieve me?
So the Gemara brought that they brought that brisa, and now the Gemara is up to the next question. And this question is a question from our Mishnah on this answer that we gave, that an egreif the size of a malay egreif is considered an oyel, even if it's not intended. The Gemara asks, now let's go back to our Mishnah. And what did our Mishnah say? That Rabbi Yehuda says you could actually dwell under a bed. You sleep under a bed, and you're fulfilling the mitzvah of Sukkah. Now, is that an oil? So what do you think? Should a bed be an oil according to Rabbi Yehuda? Yes,
So,
Victor.
so I have a bigger like concept is if we are saying Sukkot Teshvu, if you live in it, obviously people have bunk beds in their regular house. So why should it be such a big deal to have a bunk bed in your sukkah? If you're saying this is now your habitat for 7 days, why shouldn't you be able to say, well, this is how I sleep in my house. I should be able to sleep in my sukkah the same way.
So that sounds like a good claim. The problem is that the law of sleeping in your sukkah, you have to be able to say, I'm sleeping in my sukkah the way I sleep in the house. And you can't really say that because according to the halachic um, definition, you are not sleeping in your sukkah. So you can't say, I'm sleeping in my sukkah the way I sleep in my house. You're not sleeping in your sukkah. You're sleeping in a tent. And the truth is, if you take it a step deeper, you could say, you don't dwell in your house. You dwell in a tent. In other words, even year round, when you dwell in a sukkah, when you sleep in a bunk bed, you could say you're not sleeping in your house. You're sleeping in a bunk bed. But the main point is that you have to be able to claim that you're in a sukkah similar to your house, and that you can't really say because you're not really in a sukkah.
But what about the issue of being able to not being able to see the stars at night because you're on the bottom of a bunk bed?
Uh, so the stars is not the most necessary rule about a sukkah. In other words, that's not a problem.
Okay.
And generally, the rule of the stars, it's also not. It's not that you need to see stars. It's about the thickness of the schach. That there should be the ability to see the stars. Let me just pull it up over here. Um, so the next page in the Gemara um, has the Mishnah on the top of the page, and that Mishnah talks about seeing the stars, and it says over there that if the sukkah is so thick, the schach is so thick that it's that you don't see the stars from it, it's still kosher. So even seeing the stars um, is not it's not a major necessity. Of course, the sukkah is not supposed to be similar to it's not supposed to be like a roof or like your house, so on. But at the same time, if it is that thick, the schach is that thick, that's called mu'ubah. It has a thickness to it, similar to a house, that it's um, um, that you don't see the stars, it's still kosher. But anyway, so for sure it's not a problem. The bunk bed is not a problem of not seeing the stars. But anyway, we're gonna see a few of the things that we were discussing. They're coming up right the next few pages. So Metz Hashem, hopefully when we finish the next few pages, we'll see about the sukkah on a wagon. We'll see about the law of the stars and so on. These are coming right up. So stay tuned and don't miss out. We are going to begin we're going to begin on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis 21b, and we're going to start with the question Baharei Mita. I'm going to start there again. It's maybe 8 lines from the top of the page. So the Mishnah says, the Gemara says, again, 21b, 8 lines from the top, Baharei Mita. Mishnah said, the Gemara says, what about a bed? The Yesh Bakama Egroifim. It's very wide. It has many of these. It has a lot of space, and it has a lot of space. The Egroifim, the way Rashi understands it, it's from the bed to the ground. The height. There's a lot of space there, so it's definitely sizable to the extent that it should be considered an oihel. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, he said you're allowed to sleep under the bed, and even though seemingly that's considered an oihel, that's considered a tent because you have a lot of space. So the Gemara asks Utanan, and we learned in a Mishnah, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says, Noyagim hayinu. We used to do this. Shahayinu yeshenim tachas amita b'fnei hazakenim. We would sleep under the bed in front of the elders, and they never said anything to us. They seemed to be fine with it. So obviously, this type of bed, obviously, this is kosher. This is okay. And how does this fit with what we've explained? That Rabbi Yehuda holds a tent that's not meant to, without the intent to be a tent, is still considered a tent if it has a large amount of space. So the Gemara says that Shani Mita Hoyel Ulagaba Asuya. The Gemara says that a bed is different in the fact that since it is made to sleep and lie down on top of it, not to use under it, therefore, even if it has a lot of space under it, it's not considered a tent. On the regular scenario, something is not intended to be a tent, but nevertheless, we will consider it a tent if it has a certain amount of space, an egg reif, mole egg reif, a fist size or more. However, if you specifically intended it for a different purpose, that not only you didn't have in mind that it's not for a tent, but you had in mind that it's used for on top of it, that the purpose of this board, of this beam, of this mattress is to be used specifically for what's on top of it, not to be used what's under it. In this case, even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that it's not considered a tent, even though it has a lot of space, even though it has many egg reifs of space, many fist sizes of space. It's still considered it still will not be considered a tent because it's specifically intended to use above it. The Gemara asks, Shvarim nami legabon asuyim. Now the oxen also, they are meant to sit on. The space under it is not part of the usage of oxen. And according to Reb Yehuda, seemingly this should be very problematic. Why? Because if that's so, that the purpose is to use above it and not for it itself, it's specifically meant for what's above it. So then we cannot say that a shar is a tent and it's going to block the impurity from affecting the children sitting on top of the oxen. Because the fact is that the oxen are they're specifically meant to ride on top of them and not for tent purposes. So if there was no specific purpose of it, fine, you could say it's mole egg reif, it has the size of a fist. This will be considered a tent, even though it was not intentionally made as a tent. But if it's specifically used for something else, like to sit on top of, then you can't say anymore that we're going to still consider that a tent. So if it's not a tent, then you have a problem with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that he says, let the children sit right on top of the oxen and they're not going to be impure because you have a tent. No, you don't have a tent under them. That's not considered a tent. That's specifically to sit on top of. It's not meant for a tent. And even if it has many egg grapes, if it's specifically used for something else, you can't call it a tent. If it has no purpose at all, fine, we can call it a tent. This specifically has a purpose to sit on top of. In fact, we're even putting the children on top of it. Here, we can't say that it's a tent. And how are you, Rabbi Yehuda, going to say that the children will ride on top of it and they're not going to be impure? They're going to be, they could get impure. This is not a good tent, according to this. So the Gemara answers, Hiyasa Ravin Amar Rabbi Elazar. When Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, Shani Shvarim Hoyel Umeginin al Haroyim. That actually the oxen are meant to be used as tents. Not only are they used for what's above it, but they actually are, their usage is, they're meant to actually be a tent for protect from the sun and from the rain for under it. Why? Because the royim would go under the oxen and protect themselves. The royim, the shepherds. B'chama mipnei hachama, when it's hot out because of the sun, or could mean yemais hachama. Either when it's hot out or when it's the summer, they would go under it mipnei hachama because of the sun. Ubegeshamim, and when there's rain or maybe in the rainy season, they would go under it mibnei agashamim because of the rain. So therefore, this would be considered an oihel, a tent, and if so, the children can ride on top of it and they will not become impure. However, the Gemara understands, but a bed is meant to be used to lie on top of, and therefore, the bed is not going to be a problem in a sukkah, and you could lie under the bed in a sukkah, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because that will not be considered an oihel, a tent. Why not? It's many a greifim, has a lot of space. Yeah, but its specific purpose is for above it and not below it. The Gemara says, no, that's not true. If so, mitanami, the bed also has a purpose below it. It's protection for the shoes and the sandals that are under it, and therefore it would be considered a oihel. It would be considered a tent, and that is one of its purposes. And the Gemara specifically says the min olim and sandalim. Of course, a person's not supposed to put food under their bed. And the that says a talmidei chachamim, a bed of the scholars. You could tell because they have their shoes and their sandals under it. So that is the understanding here, that a bed also is some type of a protection, and it's an oihel, it's a tent over these shoes. So the Gemara is, and therefore it should be considered an oihel. And why does Rabbi Yehuda allow someone to sleep under the bed? And so we went back and forth. We've had a whole dialogue here. And the Gemara finally says, that Ella Amar Rava, rather, Rava says that the answer to this contradiction, the bed is not a tent. The oxen are a tent. How do you reconcile these contradictory concepts? So the Gemara says, Shani shvarim hoyel ba'asuyim lahagein al b'nei ma'ayim shalom. The Gemara's conclusion is that when you use something a little under it, that's not considered an oihel, a tent. So you want to tell me the shoes are under the bed? That doesn't do it. You want to tell me that the shepherds, they sit, they protect themselves under the oxen? That's not going to give it a rule the rule of a tent. It's used for above it. That's it. therefore it will not be considered a tent. The bed is used to lie on top of. The oxen are used to sit on top of them. These are not considered tents. Yeah, you want to tell me the shepherd sits under it, and that's minimal. That's a minimal type of usage under it. That's not going to give it a rule that it's considered an oyhel, a tent. However, the Gemara Rava says shani shvarim, oxen are different in the fact that they are considered a tent, not because the shepherds sit on. Their body is considered. We have a pasuk that says that their body is considered a tent, and it has to do with the fact that it covers the back of theirs, covers over and protects their stomach, their limbs, their innards. And what is the pasuk? Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Aru basar talbisheni. The skin and flesh you have clothed me with. Meaning the inner limbs are clothed with skin and flesh. And you have given schach to me, you have given a tent to me with the atzomais, the limbs, the bones, and the sinews. And we have a pasuk that basically says that the bones and the sinews are considered an oyel, they're considered a tent, and they protect the person or the animal with they give with an oyel, with a ruler, with a schach. So basically, the shar logically would not be considered a tent, but because we have a pasuk, the pasuk says it's considered a tent. Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, the children can ride on top of it. The children can ride on top of it because the backbone, the spine of the shar is considered a tent. It blocks, it protects the body. And Tosfos mentions this pasuk in Eov is talking about people, person, but the Tosfos says for sure an animal would be considered that way because the animal is actually horizontal. A person, vertical. It's a little surprising to say this concept of Teseichecheni, but Kal v'chomer, Tosfos says an animal is horizontal for sure. It's considered an oyel, and so that's basically the first answer that the Gemara gives is this understanding that we have a pasuk that basically tells us a shor is considered an oyel. Based on that, Rabbi Yehuda can have, it's not a contradiction. The children can sit on top of the ox. They're not going to be tummy. There's an oyel under the adults can lie under a bed and consider themselves that they slept in a sukkah, and it's not considered an oyel. Why? Because the bed is meant for what's above it. Yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, here we're dealing with shepherds being beneath oxen. There's a Gemara that there were two sages whose stomachs were so large that if they were facing each other, a team of oxen could pass under them. Yeah, so would they be a no help for the ox?
I mean, it says that a person could be an oyel, right? But their stomachs, yeah, I remember that Gemara. I think it's in the end of, is it Bava Metzia? I think it's in Bava Metzia. In any event,
and towards the end of brachas, I think there's one of the Talmidim under the bed of Abaye, and he discovers him underneath and goes, "What are you doing here?"
Right. I wanted to learn. Yeah. Taka. We have, we got stories like that. Yeah. The well, we have the story of Rachel. Rachel was under the bed when Yaakov got married to Leah. According to the Medrash.
Imagine.
According to the Medrash, Rachel was under the bed, and when Yaakov asked questions, Rachel answered, and that's how he got fooled into thinking that he's lying with Rachel. Really, was lying with Leah. Rachel was just under the bed. We got stories like that. There's a Hasidic Maisa with the Alter Rebbe that, forget who it was. One of the big Chassidim wanted to. He became a Chassid, and he wanted to see the Alter Rebbe. And he kept traveling, kept missing the Alter Rebbe. Finally, he figured he'll travel to where the Alter Rebbe is going to be able to see him. So he went and he hid under the bed where the Alter Rebbe was gonna sleep. Anyway, the Alter Rebbe walks to the room and he says, "Der junger man, this young man who's hiding, and he has a question in Erchen, because he had prepared a question to ask the Alter Rebbe about Tractate Erchen. He says he should, I think the answer, he says he should measure himself before he is trying to measure me, something like that." And then the Alter Rebbe left. In the meantime, he didn't see the Alter Rebbe, but he became a chassid of the Mittler Rebbe. Forget the story. Mordechai, you remember the story better than me?
No, but there's also a story with
Reb Hillel Parcher, that's what it was.
Well, also with the Mittler Rebbe, where the Alter Rebbe would sometimes tell things to his daughter Freda, the Mittler Rebbe's brother, and the Mittler Rebbe wanted to hear what the Alter Rebbe was telling her, and it says like one time he was talking to her about the big Godim of the Kohen Gadol, and he didn't address he didn't address one of the items, so he slipped his girdle out from under the bed to tell her.
I think it was a closet. I think that story is the closet. He was hiding in the closet.
Okay.
But maybe you heard it with the bed. Okay. But yeah, he wanted to ask him about what's the Chassidus, the meaning of the gartel of the avnet of the Kohen Gadol. Yeah. Very nice. Okay. So yeah, we got a lot of stories of these type of stories. Anyway, bottom line is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, they slept. They hung out under the bed, and they slept there. And our Mishnah, the story of Tevi Avdoi, that Tevi slept under the bed in the Sukkah. Okay, so this is the first answer of the Gemara, that we have a pasuk that an animal, basically it proves that an animal that a shar could be considered an oyel. The person could be considered an oyel because of his flesh. The shar is considered an oyel. The Gemara says, and if you want, you could answer it differently. And the way to answer it differently would be as follows: that in truth, sleeping under a bed is an oil. And so this could be problematic. That you're under a shard, that's considered an oil, it's a tent. Sleeping under a bed is a tent. So how did Reb Yehuda sleep under under the bed in the sukkah? And why would it be that wasn't a problem? So the answer is because Reb Yehuda goes according to his reason. Yes, it's considered an oil, but in this scenario, the way Reb Yehuda has it set up, it's gonna be okay. Why? Because Reb Yehuda holds the Amar Sukkah Diras Keva B'inan. He holds that the sukkah needs to be permanent. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, that the sukkah is considered an oyel keva. It has to be more permanent. And we had that in the beginning of the Gemara. He held that a sukkah could be made above 20 amos because the sukkah he holds it sukkah diras keva beinon. He holds it needs to be permanent. And so if so, when he's under a bed, then mita diras arai comes out that the bed will be considered a very temporary dwelling. The sukkah oyel keva in the sukkah will be the permanent dwelling. V'loy asi oyel arai umavatel oyel keva. In this temporary tent doesn't ruin the permanent tent. In other words, because the oyel that he's sleeping in, which is this under the bed, it's so temporary, and the sukkah is permanent. You can't say that he's dwelling in the tent. Why not? This is a tent. But the answer is because the sukkah is being the permanence that the sukkah has. It's considered that you're in the sukkah. You can't say, "Oh, I'm dwelling in a tent." That tent is nothing. You're inside a solid sukkah. You can call that if you're in one structure and that's inside another structure, so they're both somewhat permanent or they're both somewhat temporary. Then you will say you're in this structure. You're not in that structure. But here, the structure itself is a solid structure. Therefore, you can't say that you can't say that I'm in the bed. I'm under the bed and I'm not in a sukkah. No, you're not. You can't say that I'm not. I am under the sukkah. You are under the sukkah because the sukkah is a permanent dwelling. Now, the question really is, if you go back in the Gemara had different reasons explaining the 20 Amor rule. One of them said because Rabbi Yehuda holds of the sukkah has to be permanent. The other opinions, not necessarily did they hold that. So what will they do? How do they understand that Rabbi Yehuda allows you to sleep under a bed if they don't hold that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the sukkah needs to be permanent? If you hold the sukkah needs to be permanent, if that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, fine. We can understand that a oyel arai, a temporary tent, doesn't override a oyel keva, a permanent tent. Okay, that's understandable. But according to the other opinions, that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't necessarily hold that the sukkah needs to be a permanent tent. What would they hold? They have to learn, like the earlier answer. They have to follow the earlier answer that the bed is not considered an oyel. But this answer holds that the bed is an oyel, just relative to the sukkah. It doesn't override the sukkah, and we consider it that you're inside the sukkah. Now, what does this mean in this Gemara? Does Rabbi Yehuda really hold that the sukkah needs to be so permanent? What happens if you made it somewhat temporary? I understand Rabbi Yehuda allows it to be permanent. It's above 20 amos, 20 cubits, maybe 30 to 40 feet. It's going to have to be permanent, and Rabbi Yehuda allows such a sukkah. The other opinions don't. But Rabbi Yehuda allows it. Other opinions don't agree with that. The Tanakama of our Mishnah, of the first Mishnah, didn't agree with that. But does Rabbi Yehuda hold that it needs to be permanent? So according to this Gemara, it looks like Rabbi Yehuda holds that it needs to really be a permanent sukkah. That you can't get away with these flimsy sukkahs. Now, we don't hold that way, but this is Rabbi Yehuda's shita, at least according to one way of learning this Gemara, is that Rabbi Yehuda holds it needs to be a permanent sukkah. Now, the other way of learning it is that no, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold you need to have a permit. Rabbi Yehuda holds it's okay for it to be temporary. But because the sukkah could be permanent, therefore, every sukkah is called a diras keva. And we will say that an oyel that's temporary, a temporary dwelling, will not ruin it because the sukkah could be permanent. So we look at the sukkah as if all sukkahs are permanent dwellings. In other words, he has no problem with a sukkah that's permanent. And because of that, we look at your sukkah as if you're dwelling in a permanent dwelling. That's your place of dwelling. The other opinions hold it's not allowed to be permanent. That means we have to look at your sukkah as a temporary dwelling. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, that the sukkah is allowed to be permanent. So that means that we look at sukkahs as he sees a sukkah being that's a permanent type of place of dwelling. You're there for a week. Your sukkah is allowed to be permanent. So if you're there, if you're dwelling in a sukkah, we look at it as permanent, and therefore any oyel that's temporary will never be considered a problem in a sukkah. And sleeping under a bed is not a problem. So that's another way of learning. It doesn't go as smooth. The first way of learning, of course, is more smooth. The problem with the first way is that we don't have any proof that Rabbi Yehuda really holds that any sukkah that's flimsy is not a kosher sukkah. We don't have a proof to say that. The first opinion is explaining Rabbi Yehuda in a way that we're not aware of. We don't have any place where it says that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow a sukkah to be temporary. We have a place where it says a sukkah can be permanent. Do we have a place where it says it has to be permanent? I mean, the wording, sukkah diras keva be'inan, is an interesting wording. The literal wording of it does sound like that, actually. That sukkah diras keva be'inan. We need sukkah to be a diras keva. But the wording, at least the simple understanding of that wording is that it's not that it has to be diras keva. It's that it's okay. It's allowed to be diras keva. It's sort of a little loose, the translation of the words, but the first understanding, the first that I shared with you, I guess holds that these words are very literal. Sukkah diras keva be'inan. You mamish need it to be a diras keva. The other understanding is no. We don't see any source for that. It's just it uses those words, sukkah diras keva be'inan, but it's that we consider your sukkah to be a sukkah that's a keva.
Rabbi, are we talking about two different things? When you're saying that the sukkah should be a dirat keva is for you during the holiday, that's where you should be all the time. Whereas when you're saying in the other way, when you can interpret it in a different way, that the physical sukkah itself has to be permanent. In one case, in one way, you're saying the physical sukkah itself has to be considered to be permanent. In the other way, you're basically saying you as the person during the holiday you must act as if this location is your permanent
dwelling. Mm-hmm. Right. So the thing is that whenever we bring this discussion of sukkah diras keva or sukkah diras arai, the Gemara is always referring to a halacha of how the sukkah is built. Now, what you're saying about how you feel it, how you think about sukkah being that during sukkahs you should think that way or feel that way. That would be more like drush on the concept. You're supposed to
Rebbe,
yes.
Rebbe, can you mute us all, please?
Okay, yeah. So I would think that's a nice insight, Ezra, but it's not. When the Gemara uses this term, it's constantly using it in a form of in the context of the halacha of how permanent the actual sukkah, the physical sukkah should be. And so therefore that interpretation is the correct interpretation of sukkah diras keva be'inan. Now, what you're adding to it is not wrong. But it's more like a deeper insight based on this concept of sukkah diras keva, or and especially because you have to ask yourself, what would the other opinions hold? Are you supposed to feel that this sukkah is where you're dwelling? I mean, it's Teshvu Kain Taduru. So even the Shitas that hold that a sukkah can't be more than 20 amos, they also hold that you should dwell in the sukkah. It should be diras keva in a certain sense, that you should that you should really dwell there. So that's why when the Gemara uses the term sukkah diras keva, it definitely is referring to the physical sukkah, and that's the literal meaning. But of course, you could maybe get some. I'm sure there must be some drush about it, and spiritually how you're supposed to picture the sukkah, and maybe somehow explain the different opinions, diras keva, diras arai. I'm sure there must be drush about it, which I happen not to have be aware of right now, but I'm sure I'm sure there must be a lot of discussion about that. Okay, so we've explained Rabbi Yehuda two ways. In other words, the Gemara's answer. The Gemara has given two answers to explain Rabbi Yehuda and why, how his rulings are not contradictory to each other, and because he has one ruling about sleeping under a sukkah, another ruling about sitting children on top of an ox. And how do these two rulings not contradict? We've got the two answers here about the fact that there's a pasuk that says a shor is an oyel, or really it wouldn't be an oyel, and really bed is not an oyel, even though you put shoes or something under it, that's not considered an oyel. And because the fact that it's mainly for what's on top of it, and that would be one answer. And the other answer that the Gemara gives is that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a sukkah has to be keva, and therefore, and on this itself, we had two ways of explaining that. But however you explain it, the oyel of the bed, which is considered an oyel, but not when it comes to a sukkah that's around it, that's keva. When the sukkah around it, when you consider the sukkah around it keva, or it is physically keva, or it's considered to be keva, the permanent, the sukkah around the tent is permanent, then we don't look at your bed as an oyel that would say you're in an oyel, you're in a tent, and you're not in the sukkah. No, we wouldn't say that. An oyel arai doesn't override an oyel keva. Temporary tent doesn't override a permanent tent. It doesn't negate a permanent tent, and therefore you're inside the sukkah and it's kosher. Now the Gemara says, Reb Shimon the Amar Nami Sukkah Diras Keva Bina. Now, Reb Shimon, the Gemara is not satisfied with this second answer, because we're sort of opening up a can of worms, because now we have to deal with Reb Shimon. And the problem is that Reb Shimon, we know he also holds Sukkah Diras Keva Bina. Okay, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is, look back at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah on page 20b, the Mishnah that we're discussing, Reb Shimon is the one who brings this story of Tevi.
Who slept under the bed.
Who slept under the bed. Why? Because he's not obligated to sleep in a sukkah. What does that mean? That Reb Shimon holds that a bed is an oyel, is a tent. But Reb Shimon holds that a sukkah is a diras keva, is permanent. So we see from Reb Shimon that a temporary dwelling overrides a permanent dwelling. If you're inside a bed, under a bed, that's an oyel, and you can't consider yourself in a sukkah. Even though Reb Shimon holds that a sukkah is diras keva, he holds a sukkah has to be permanent. And we had that in a previous Gemara, that Reb Shimon is of that opinion, because he said that sukkah needs to have 4 walls, and he learned the sukkah, the different letters, it has extra vavs, and and so on. And he learned about how many walls, and the Gemara said, oh, he holds the Sukkah Diras Keva. So if that's so, we now have a problem. So the Gemara says, V'had Reb Shimon, the Amar Nami Sukkah Diras Keva Binan. Reb Shimon, that also says, he also says Sukkah Diras Keva Binan. V'asi Oyel Arai, Umavatal Oyel Keva. It comes out that Reb Shimon says you could, that a temporary tent is going to override a permanent tent. So this seems to prove wrong what we just explained in Reb Yehuda. We thought that we have now a little kunz, we have a little way of getting around the problem. We're going to say Reb Yehuda, who holds Sukkah Diras Keva, he allows you to sleep under a bed because it's Ayal Arai. No. That doesn't work. You can't come up with that little way of dre. You can't dre it that way. Because Reb Shimon also holds Sukkah Diras Keva, and he doesn't allow you to sleep under a sukkah. So you can't,
under a bed.
This way is sleep under a bed. You can't play that game of, the Sukkah is Diras Keva. You hold the sukkah is permanent, then you can sleep under a bed because the bed is only a temporary. You can't do it. Reb Shimon says clearly not that way. The Gemara says, no, this is the argument of Reb Shimon and Reb Yehuda. The Gemara says, you can still say that answer because Reb Yehuda holds that's a good claim. Reb Shimon doesn't agree with it. So the Gemara says, the Gemara answers, Baha pligi. This is exactly what they're arguing about. And it's not a problem. Because you're right, Reb Shimon holds his way, but Reb Yehuda argues. This specific logic is where they argue. Marsav, our master, Reb Shimon holds Asi Oyel Arim Batal Oyel Keva, that an oil, a temporary tent, does override and negate the permanent tent of the sukkah. And he would say, you're sleeping under a bed. You're not sleeping in a sukkah, and therefore you can't do it. Only Tevi could do such a thing because he's not obligated in a sukkah. But a regular person is not allowed to sleep under a bed. Umar Savar, but Reb Yehuda holds that a temporary tent is not going to negate a permanent tent. It's not going to override it. And therefore, if you want to sleep under a bed, it's no problem, according to Reb Yehuda, because the sukkah is the overriding factor. You're in a structure of a sukkah. Yeah, okay, I'm in under a bed. That's a oil arai. It's a temporary tent. I'm still in a sukkah. I'm in a sukkah and it's kosher, and that's where Reb Yehuda holds. And so this is what they specifically argue about. If an oil arai can negate an oil keva, if a temporary tent can negate a permanent tent. Now comes the next Gemara. Reb Shimon. So the Gemara says, Reb Shimon says, Maisa b'tevi avdoi, b'tevi. The Maisa of Tevi, Avdoi, his servant, Rabbi Gamliel's servant. And the Mishnah said that story. So the Gemara says, Tanya, it was taught we learned in a Braisa, Amar Reb Shimon. The Braisa says a little different wording than the Mishnah. The Braisa says, Reb Shimon says, Nisi Chosei Shel Rabban Gamliel, a little different than the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Lefi Darkeinu Lamad, along the same lines, but different wording. The Mishnah said, according to our way, we understood that a person who sleeps under a bed is not fulfilling his obligation. That's the way our Mishnah said it. The Braisa says, from the Sicha of Rabban Gamliel, from the statement, from the talk from his talking, Misichasai of Rabban Gamliel, Lamadnu Shnei Dvarim, we learned two things. What were the two things we learned? Lamadnu Sha'avadim Paturin Min HaSukkah. We learned that the Avadim are exempt from a sukkah. Actually, the Mishnah didn't spell that out either. The Mishnah didn't spell out that we learned that that an Eved is patur from a sukkah. I mean, it's obvious, but the Mishnah didn't spell it out. Here, the Brisa spells it out. We learned that Avadim are patur min sukkah, And now in the Lamadnu Shayoshin Tachzamita lo yotze yidei chayv basi. And that's what our Mishnah really said, that the person who sleeps under a bed has not fulfilled his obligation. So that's the Brisa's word. That's the wording of the Brisa. Now, the Gemara says, why does he use the word misichase shel Rabban Gamliel from his sicha? The lema midvarav shel Rabban Gamliel. Why doesn't it say from his words, not from his sicha? Sicha is like a different type of term. Rashi says it's a lashon sichas chulin v'simcha. Sicha is like when you're just schmoozing. Sichas chulin, talking mundane. Casually. Thank you, Isaac. Casually. Good word. Talking casually. And simcha, and you're enjoying the conversation, having a happy conversation, a fun conversation. And this was more of an important talk that he. Why would you use the word misichasa? So the Gemara says, Milsa agav orche kamash malon. This is teaching us something that's on the side. It's use that word to teach us like an extra point. What is it teaching us? Ki hada amar Rav Acha bar Ada, like this, that Rav Acha bar Ada said, Bamila, and some say amar Rav Acha bar Ada, amar Rav Nuna, amar Rav, that it's not just Rav Acha bar Ada, but it's Rav Acha bar Ada in the name of Rav Abnun and in the name of Rav. That minayin. How do we know? Sha'afilu sichas chulin. That even sichas tamidei chachamim, minayin sha'afilu sichas tamidei chachamim, shrichen limud. On the side, I have sichas chulin. I don't know if you have that on the side, but I have on the side that there's an extra word there. Not just sichas tamidei chacham, but sichas chulin. Shel Talmidei Chacham. Sichas chulin of Talmidei Chachamim tzrichen limud. That even the casual talk, or mundane talk of the scholars needs to be learned. It's important to learn it. And the point is that you will, from their words, you will learn learn important matters. You will find out. It'll be. You're going to learn different words of Torah from. And as Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, and this is the first chapter of Tehillim, va'alehu la yibol, and its leaves will not wither. And what does that mean? That means that a Talmud Chacham, a scholar, the Rashi says the leaves will not wither. The leaves are something light. Something light, it doesn't wither. It's important also. But what does this mean? It means that the tree is a scholar, and he has fruits, and the leaves, even the
casual talk,
the casual growth,
casual talk,
which is similar to the casual growth,
still leaves,
not
right.
the fruit. The fruit, is regular Torah, but the casual talk, which is like the fruit, the leaves, that is not going to waste. It's needed, and therefore, Reb Shimon, the Brisa says, Reb Shimon says from the Sicha of Rabban Gamliel, because we're learning about the importance of even the Sicha that we should also learn from, and so that's the message of this wording. Okay, so bottom line is that we have Reb Shimon's opinion, which is regarding the Sukkah Keva, and we have that he holds that even though it's a Keva, you can't sleep under a bed. Reb Yehuda held Sukkah Diras Keva, you could sleep under, even though it's Sukkah Diras Keva, you could sleep under a bed. So that was a machlokes. And then the conclusion of the Gemara here is that the Reb Shimon, the Gemara brings the Mishnah, and we have a Brisa that uses the word bisicha, misichase shel Rabban Gamliel, and the understanding is that it's from the Sikh of Rabban Gamliel. It specifically uses that word to tell us the importance of even casual talk of a Talmud Chacham.